Now, the system we use to classify life is called cladistics now. This is kind of our modern system. And so cladistics is going to try to group things based upon the characters that they possess. Now, a lot of these characters, once again, will be biochemical. So it's okay if that's genes, if that's proteins. It doesn't have to be physical. So when we're doing this, what we're looking for is these two kinds of traits that we've brought up before. The ancestral ones that basically everybody shares because the common ancestor of the entire group in question had that trait. And then we're also looking for these derived characters, which derived characters are going to be characters that some of the organisms, but not all, that are part of this group evolved. And so as we analyze who's got which derived characters, we can start to piece together which organisms kind of split off first, which ones split off second, and so we can kind of group things together chronologically based upon how many traits that you have. The individual with the most derived characteristics is typically put on the end, so we consider them as having evolved more recently. Now keep in mind, being on the end sometimes people think of as being the most evolved, but with evolution oftentimes simple is better. So just because something evolves more characters, that doesn't mean it's inherently better. I don't want you guys to think that in this idea of evolution that there's like things that have done a good job and things that have done a bad job, and there's like complex good stuff and there's simple bad stuff. Jellyfish, which are very simple, are doing extraordinary right now. They are taking over the oceans. Bacteria are still doing extraordinary. So please don't think just having more stuff necessarily means better. If you're not sure about this, go watch the show Hoarders. Now, a way we represent all this data, the way we can represent these ancestral and derived characteristics and organize stuff so it's easy for us to follow, is to do it visually with something called a cladogram. So with a cladogram, we're going to start off with our ancestral trait at the bottom, and we're going to work our way up through more and more derived characters. So let's look at a picture so we can kind of see how this works in practice. So here's a sample cladogram of plants. So early on, we're going to focus on plants that have vascular tissue. This just means they have these strings of cells that ultimately are able to transport sugar. We know this is sap. That's called phloem cells. And then they've got xylem, which transport water. So plants have something kind of like veins and arteries inside of them, but in this case it's kind of transferring water, and there's a separate set that transfers sugar. So if those are the ones we're most interested in, we're going to include one guy called an outgroup. So it's a guy closely related but not part of the group in question. So we're most interested in kind of these guys, but we're going to throw mosses in here as our outgroup just for comparison. And our ancestral trait's going to be what goes down on the bottom here. This is something they all have. They say anchors or roots because mosses don't technically have roots. They instead have a separate structure that anchors it, but it's not truly a root. Because to be a root, you need to have vascular tissue, and they don't. And so then as we move up, we're going to come to our next kind of junction. So our next junction is going to be right here. And that's between the mosses and ferns. So because it's after the mosses, that means the mosses will not have this trait in question, so vascular tissue. So mosses do not have vascular tissue. But the fact that vascular tissue is here means everybody from here on out should have vascular tissue. If they didn't, that would be a new derived character that they lost vascular tissue. So ferns, conifers, and lilies all will have vascular tissue. Then as we move up, we're going to get to our next derived characteristic, in this case seeds. The fact that it's after ferns indicates that ferns don't have seeds, which they don't. They have something called spores instead. And so we have seeds are going to be present in everything from here on out, so namely the conifers and the flowering plants. And then from there we can move on to the next characteristic, which would be flowers. Flowers comes after the conifers, so this means that pines don't have flowers, which is true, but ultimately lilies and other flowering plants do, and that's correct. So the way we set up a cladogram tries to be very organized, where we start at the bottom with the ancestral characteristic, then we start to add derived characters. And you'll notice the last derived character is only shared by the very last group. Nobody else has it. So if we look at these lilies, lilies possess anchors or roots, vascular tissue, seeds, and flowers. Where if we look at something like ferns, they only have anchors or roots and vascular tissue. They lack seeds and flowers. And this is very, very useful because we can see what character was like the new thing that made us think of this as separate from the previous groups. I can tell right at a glance why ferns and conifers are separate. I can see kind of what that new evolutionary novelty, this new derived character was that kind of separated them. So this is kind of wonderful, especially for storytelling, and it's also very, very clear and concise. Prior to this, you could look at lots of different traits, and so it got to be very muddled of whether it should be a different group or not. But with a cladogram, it's very clear at exactly what you think defines the difference between one group and the next. And it also tells a great story about the chain of these derived events as we get a new derive followed by a newer derive and another derived character, so that ultimately by the end you have organisms that have many derived characters all within their group. So it shows us this great chain of events where we get some organisms that kind of keep doing what they're doing. They don't kind of change to have the new derived character, whereas there's a separate group that does, and then it continues on and on and on. And I love this because all these guys are still alive today. So it kind of shows us that it's not that these derived characters were absolutely the most amazing thing ever, but it did, at least in some instances, allow these newer organisms that have the derived characters to succeed in some environments that they couldn't before. That doesn't mean that they're the best for all environments. Mosses are still around, but ultimately it usually gave them the advantage for at least some specific conditions that allowed for that particular type of organism, in this case plants, to continue to colonize and continue to be successful in more and more different environments.